Again, I rise at this moment to speak about the Smarter Sentencing Act, which I believe is a very critical piece of legislation. I'm pleased to be an original co-sponsor of the legislation in this Congress, but really want to give a lot of respect to this bipartisan coalition of senators who have come together, led by Senator Mike Lee from Utah and Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois. Their leadership on this issue has been absolutely critical. Smarter Sentencing Act has essential what's called front-end reforms. These are reforms when a person gets to the point of incarceration, and what they actually do is they combat injustices in the federal sentencing program, and they address a real plague in our country, and that is mass incarceration. Think about this. We are the land of the free. We are a nation that believes in liberty and justice, but we are singular in humanity for an awful distinction. We have 5% of the globe's population, but we incarcerate 25% of the globe's incarcerated people. Now that's unacceptable unless you believe for some reason that Americans have a prior proclivity for crime, unless you believe that we have something in our water that makes us more likely to do wrong, and that is not the case. The challenge is that we have seen in the last 3 decades a profound over-incarceration driven by a drug war that has created unfortunate negative consequences to our society. Now, I want to thank folks for stepping up in this Congress to speak to this issue. It is un-American that we should hold the largest amount of incarcerated people per population than any other country. It goes against the very strains of our society dedicated to liberty, dedicated to keeping government focused on what it should be doing, not overreaching, not becoming overly aggressive, not surrendering or taking the liberty unnecessarily of other Americans. I'd like to talk a few minutes about this broken system. What is it about this system? Well, when we have about 3/4 of our federal prisoners are actually non-violent offenders, because I'm one of those people that believe if you do a violent crime, you should pay a very hefty price for that. That we as a society should have a place where we take stern action against people who promulgate violence, who undermine civil society. But as we look at this mass incarceration problem where 25% of the globe's prison population is in our country, we realize that 3/4 of those people in the federal prison system are nonviolent offenders. And this is not our history. This is not our tradition. Over the course of all of our nation's history, we did not have this problem. It's really been the last 30 years where we have witnessed the explosion of the United States federal prison population. In those 30 years alone, think about this. In the last 30 years alone, the prison population at the federal level has exploded 800 times. 800 times. That is a massive and unacceptable increase, especially when you realize that this was driven by the incarceration of nonviolent offenders. And when this explosion has happened, what's worse is that it has an undermining effect when those people are released in empowering them to stay out of prison, because once you have a nonviolent felony offense, it's hard to get a job, it's hard to get business licenses, you can't get Pell Grants, and what often happens is those people get caught up going back to being involved in the drug world. And so what happens is that 2 out of 3 of those people get rearrested within 3 years. And we are paying for this broken system, this revolving door of arresting nonviolent offenders, releasing them, bringing them back into our system. It is plaguing the federal budget and, frankly, state budgets all around our country. It cost 3/4 over $250 billion each year is being spent on this broken criminal justice system. Money that could be used to empower people to succeed, could be used for repairing our infrastructure, or hey, how about this? It could be used to be kept in taxpayers' pockets. And what makes this system worse, what is painful to American ideals, as we look across the way from the Capitol building where I stand now and see the Supreme Court, written above the Supreme Court building at the top is this idea of equal justice under law, that everyone will be treated equally under the law. But this broken criminal justice system is disproportionately impacted certain Americans and not others. More than 60% of our prison population is comprised of racial and ethnic minorities. And the painful reality of that is if somehow African Americans or Latinos use drugs at different levels than whites, yeah, that might explain it. If they dealt drugs at different levels, yeah, that might explain it, but that is not the case. African Americans engage in drug offenses at a lower rate than whites, but are incarcerated at a rate 10 times that of whites. And what is alarming about the mass incarceration is that people are actually not committing more and more crimes. The National Research Council recently released a report confirming what numerous other studies have actually shown. Incarceration rates are actually not tied to crime rates. We've seen incarceration rates going up and up and up, but now crime rates are coming down. What is perpetuating this explosion is this war on drugs that has created, over the last 30 years alone, an over-criminalization of nonviolent individuals, stacking our prison population full of Americans disproportionately minority and disproportionately poor. Please understand, the people paying the highest price for this are the poor in our country. The New York Times published an article detailing how our jails have become warehouses made up primarily of people too poor to pay bail or to hire lawyers, or too ill with mental health or drug problems to adequately care for themselves. If you look at our prison population, you'll see that poverty, race, mental illness, that those are the folks that are being disproportionately incarcerated. And I'm telling you right now, we all know this at our core ideals of fairness and democracy and justice. This is not who we are. This is not right. This demands that we examine this broken system and do those common sense things that are needed to make our justice system just, to work first and foremost for our safety, to not be a gross waste of taxpayer dollars, and to make sure that basic ideas of fairness are fulfilled. Now, this is not just speculation. This is what is so powerful about this moment in time, because all that I've said so far is compelling enough, but what is exciting is that we as federal actors, the 100 senators here, the 435 congresspeople, the president and the vice president, don't need to figure out a way forward. Make it up, design legislation based on our own ideas. We actually only have to look at the pathway forward by looking at governors and legislatures in the states. So burdened by the cost of this unruly system, a system that is plaguing right now, the Federal Bureau of Prisons is plaguing our country and its cost. What states are doing, who are bearing that cost, is they're finding pragmatic, common sense, bipartisan ways to move forward. In fact, what gets me excited is, as a Democrat, that you just have to look at the red states. What red states are doing to reduce their prison populations. Let me give you an example. States such as Texas, Georgia, North Carolina are leading on this issue, and the federal government should follow. Look, Texas is a state known for law and order, tough on crime. And yet they realize that being smart on crime means saving taxpayer dollars, using that money efficiently and effectively, lowering crime, and guess what? Hey, we can also lower our prison population and empower people to be successful in life and not slip down that slope back towards recidivism. They've made tremendous strides in Texas in adopting policies that are designed to reduce their prison population, lower recidivism. In 2007, Texas boasted the 4th largest incarceration rate in the country. And faced with a budget projection that estimated by 2012 the state would need an additional 17,000 prison beds. Think about that for a second. They saw that they were going to need to either build more prisons, house 17,000 more prison beds. It was going to cost them $2 billion in Texas. The state's legislature said, enough of this madness, enough of this craziness. They enacted bold reforms that would act as a model for us in the federal legislature. And as a result, they passed this broad-based legislation. Texas was able to stabilize their prison population and avert that budgetary disaster. Texas State Representative Jerry Madden, a Republican, noted in a recent hearing before the House Judiciary Committee and Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security, he said that the crime rate is now at 1968 levels. They were able to close, not open, but close 3 prisons and 6 juvenile facilities. And remarkably, the Texas prison system is now operating at a 96% capacity. Common sense reforms. Georgia is another state. They've made remarkable progress. This area they are showing can show dividends for taxpayers, can lower crime. In fact, over the past 5 years, Georgia has reduced, in terms of the racial disparities in incarceration, Georgia has reduced the number of black men incarcerated in their state by 20%. And they haven't seen crime go up, quite the contrary. They've seen it go down. And these states are proving that you don't have to lock people more up to create that safety we desire. States like New Jersey, Texas, California, Virginia, Hawaii, Wyoming, Massachusetts, Kentucky, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Colorado, New York, South Carolina, Alaska, and Georgia have all seen drops in crime rates as they've been implementing common sense criminal justice reform. And so let's be clear. What I'm advocating for is, yes, the Smarter Sentencing Act, but you know what we should be doing? Moving for bold, broad-based criminal justice reform, copying the success of red states with Republican governors, look at their innovation, follow their common sense, and mirror their success at the federal level. And so those are the reforms. Reforms at the front end when people get arrested, reforms to prison systems and what goes on in prison, and helping people when they come out of prison to stay out of prison. Front end reforms, what are going on around our country, are exciting. Things like sentencing reform and drug court reform, radical ideas like, hey, let's let judges make decisions about sentencing and stop trying to legislate it, because judges are the experts. They know the totality of a person's circumstances. They can design sentences. These policy initiatives should address the entire system. Behind-the-wall efforts should focus on initiatives that change the way that prisoners experience life behind bars. This is common sense stuff. We shouldn't send people to prison and have them get criminalized or undermine their ability to be successful adults when they come out. And that's where we should also focus, which is on that back end, this idea that we need re-entry policies that help people get jobs, reconnect with their families, and become strong, full-fledged American citizens. Things like parole reform, To move forward, we need to think big. This is what I will be advocating for. We can tackle this by taking a systemic approach. We must look at a broad-based reform agenda. Now, I love the fact that we have conservatives and liberals united on this issue. Republicans and Democrats, red staters and blue staters. Criminal justice reform is not a partisan issue, it is an American issue. In 2010, senators on both sides of the aisle came together to improve our justice system by passing the Fair Sentencing Act, which the president signed into law. This was a bipartisan piece of legislation that reduced the sentencing disparities between crack and powdered cocaine, drugs that are pharmacologically indistinguishable. They changed it from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1, and I thank Senators Durbin, Grassley, Leahy, Graham for their leadership on this issue. Last year, I joined with Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky. I don't know how many sentences people use with Cory Booker and Rand Paul in them, but we agree on this issue. We have common ground, and we introduced the REDEEM Act. This legislation aims to keep juveniles out of the criminal justice system. We look to stop acts that many other countries consider torture, like taking juveniles and routinely putting them into solitary confinement, where they're traumatized and often come out of those circumstances more likely to do harm to themselves or others. We're going to reintroduce that bill this year. And just last week, I sat on a criminal justice reform panel right here in the halls of the Senate, hosted by Van Jones on the left and Newt Gingrich on the right. In the last few months, I've talked to Grover Norquist. I've talked to the Koch brothers representative, their chief counsel. I've talked to conservative think tanks, Christian evangelicals, all of us agreeing on this issue. This chorus of voices, this coalition, this courageous commitment to our country's ideals lets you know that whether you consider yourself a liberal or a conservative, whether you consider yourself moderate, leaning left or right, this is an area we can agree because it's going to save taxpayer money. It's going to uphold our ideals of liberty and freedom. It's going to create safer communities, and it's going to empower individuals to be successful. So today, I'm excited to have joined with other senators, Lee and Durbin, folks like folks like Senator Leahy and Senator Cruz, to join together to support the Smarter Sentencing Act. We need to have this conversation about reducing federal mandatory minimums. In fact, I love that the Urban Institute has stated that mandatory minimums for drug offenses is the single largest factor. Let me repeat that. Mandatory minimums for drug offenses are the single largest factor in the growth of the federal prison population. That 800% growth in the last 30 years has been driven by nonviolent drug offenders, and mandatory minimums are a key driver in that. This bill also would do other things. Would expand the federal safety valve, giving judges greater discretion and allowing them to hand down fair sentences. Those people who believe in separation of powers, let the judiciary have more space to hand down fair sentences, not being shackled by legislators who don't know the particulars of a case. Many federal judges have spoken out about mandatory minimums being unnecessarily restrictive to them doing their job. It would also make the Fair Sentencing Act retroactive, which would allow persons convicted under the old crack cocaine, powdered cocaine disparity that now have seen the laws change. That means if they got arrested today, they would have a lot less of a sentence. It makes it retroactive, which is only fair. Now, this bill actually could save a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars. And it could give us some freedom not only to return some to debt relief in this country, Lord knows we need to focus on that, but also to invest in other programs that many people on both sides of this aisle support, like reentry programs that help people stay out of prison and get back to a productive lifestyle. If enacted into law, as this bill seems to have scored, it would save $3 billion over the next decade alone. This is critically important. And so I end by a call to the conscience of our Congress. We, every single day, pledge allegiance to that flag. That's not something that anybody in this chamber does as sort of a rote, routine, perfunctory salute. We say those words because they mean something. And we end with this ideal that is a light to all of humanity, this ideal of liberty and justice for all. And if we mean those words, and we know that in our country right now, states are doing things to further uphold these ideals that we are on the federal level, that they are making common sense reforms that are keeping people safe and lowering crime. Common sense reforms that are saving taxpayer dollars and relieving the burden on taxpayers and budgets. They are passing reforms that liberate people from shackles and imprisonment that is unnecessary. That it is directly addressing painful disparities of race and poverty. And that it is empowering Americans, our brothers and sisters, that in all of our holy texts talk about the dignity of all people, whether they're behind bars or on your streets. If it sees the dignity of worth and empowers people, as they're doing in the state, to be successful, to have life and liberty, and to pursue their happiness, that across the board is what we should be pursuing here in this body. And so I say today that I support us reforming our criminal justice system. More importantly, I say let's support our ideals. Let's be a nation with liberty and justice for all. Let's follow the lead of courageous governors and legislatures. And let's make this nation even better than it is today.